The morning light filtered through the cracked blinds of Amara Lewis's small apartment, bathing the worn wooden floor in soft gold. The world outside was already alive, honking cars, distant chatter, the rhythm of a city that never seemed to rest. Amara sat before the mirror, her hands trembling slightly as she twisted the final curl of her hair into place. Her natural coils framed her face like a crown, bold, unapologetic, and deeply hers. She had spent years learning to love her natural hair. Years of unlearning shame, of rejecting the unspoken rules that told her beauty was only acceptable when tamed, straightened, hidden. But today she felt proud. Today she was ready. It was her first day as a senior marketing associate at one of the biggest firms in the city, Linvale Communications. She had fought her way there through unpaid internships, long nights balancing work and online classes, and countless interviews where she'd been told she was overqualified but not quite the right fit. This job was her chance to prove herself. She dressed carefully, choosing a soft beige blazer, modest gold jewelry, and her favorite notebook tucked under her arm. As she stepped out the door, she whispered to herself, not words of doubt, but words of affirmation. She had earned this. The office stood tall and gleaming, all glass and steel, reflecting the skyline inside. Everything was pristine. The faint scent of coffee and printer ink, the polished smiles of people who spoke in buzzwords and deadlines. Amara greeted her new colleagues warmly, her confidence growing as she was shown to her desk. For the first few weeks, things went smoothly. Her ideas were sharp, her presentations flawless. Clients responded well to her insight. Her reports drew praise even from upper management. She was, by every measure, succeeding. But beneath that success, something quieter began to stir, small, almost invisible acts that chipped away at her sense of belonging. The first came during a team meeting. As she took her seat, one of her coworkers, Megan, with a practiced smile, offhandedly mentioned how bold it was that Amara wore her hair so naturally in such a professional environment. Laughter followed, light but sharp enough to sting. Another day, she overheard whispers near the break room, jokes about her big hair, blocking the view during presentations. She ignored them. She had learned long ago that silence was sometimes safer than confrontation. Then came the subtle exclusions. Meetings she wasn't invited to, emails she wasn't copied on, a growing sense that she was being pushed to the margins. Still, she persisted. Her work spoke louder than their prejudice. Until one morning, she was called into the office of her supervisor, Mr. Charles Bennett, the kind of man who prided himself on company image. His desk was immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted, his smile thin and deliberate. He praised her work first. Then, as if casually, he mentioned that her presentation might be distracting to clients. When she asked what he meant, he glanced briefly at her hair. His words were wrapped in professionalism, but the message was clear: her natural curls did not fit their corporate mold. Amara sat frozen. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. She wanted to protest, to defend herself, to say that her hair was part of who she was. But he continued, suggesting that more polished look might help her career prospects. He wasn't asking, he was instructing. That night, Amara went home in silence. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, the same curls that had felt like a crown now heavy with doubt. She thought of all the women before her who had been told the same thing in different words, that professionalism had a look, a texture, a color. But the next morning, she made her decision. She walked into the office with her curls still free, still beautiful, still her. She wouldn't bow to their prejudice. By the end of the week, a notice arrived in her inbox, a meeting with HR, performance concerns. The subject line read, she sat in the sterile conference room, her stomach churning, as the HR representative delivered the verdict. They used words like company standards and team cohesion, but she heard what they didn't say. She wasn't the right image for them. Her badge was taken, her files cleared. She packed her things in a small box while her coworkers pretended not to watch. As she left the building, the cold wind tangled through her curls, lifting them gently, defiantly. She walked away with tears burning in her eyes, but also a quiet fire in her chest. They had taken her job, but they hadn't taken her pride. That night, she sat alone on her couch, surrounded by silence and the hum of city lights beyond the window. She felt broken, but not defeated. Something inside her whispered that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something larger, something she couldn't yet see. As she scrolled through her phone, an old idea resurfaced. One she had once written in a notebook years ago, a company that celebrated diversity, that told stories through authentic voices, that didn't just include people like her, but was built by them. She closed her eyes. The sting of injustice burned, but so did determination. Her ex-boss thought her hair was unprofessional. He had no idea he had just fired the woman who would one day become his boss. The weeks after Amara's firing were some of the darkest days of her life. Her savings dwindled, her confidence wavered, and every job application seemed to vanish into silence. The city that once felt alive and full of promise now loomed cold and indifferent. But in that quiet, something within her began to change. The humiliation she had endured didn't destroy her. It hardened her resolve. She refused to let that office, that narrow definition of professionalism, be the final word on her story. She spent long nights at her kitchen table, surrounded by open notebooks and half-empty coffee mugs, sketching ideas for her own venture. She called it True Tone Media, a marketing agency dedicated to telling authentic stories from diverse voices. No corporate filters, no forced assimilation, just truth, creativity, and pride. Her concept was simple but revolutionary. Instead of asking people to change themselves to fit the market, she would help brands change how they saw their audiences. Her focus was representation, inclusivity, and raw honesty. The problem was money. She had none. So she started small, freelance projects, social media campaigns for local businesses, anything she could manage from her tiny apartment. She worked through the nights, teaching herself web design, branding, and video editing. Her living room became her office, her kitchen counter her meeting space. Slowly, clients began to notice. A small bakery owned by a black couple hired her to revamp their marketing. Then a women's fashion boutique seeking more inclusive imagery found her online. Her campaigns were vibrant, authentic, and deeply human. They told real stories, and people responded. Her business began to grow. Still, there were moments of doubt, when bills piled up, when clients hesitated to pay, when exhaustion pressed on her chest like a weight. But every time she looked in the mirror and saw her curls, she reminded herself why she had started. Her hair had been the reason she was fired, but it had also become her symbol of resilience. Months passed. She built a small team, freelancers, interns, friends who believed in her vision. Together, they worked out of coffee shops and borrowed spaces. They didn't have money, but they had purpose. And purpose, she learned, could carry you farther than pride. Then came her first big break. A mid-sized tech startup reached out, impressed by her grassroots campaigns. They wanted her team to handle their product launch. It was more money than she had ever made before. Amara threw herself into the project, leading her team with precision and passion. Every color, every word, every image reflected her belief that authenticity was more powerful than polish. When the campaign launched, it went viral. Sales tripled within a month. The startup credited True Tone Media for their success. The emails started flooding in. Larger clients, bigger contracts, investors wanting to meet her. The momentum was unstoppable. She rented her first office, a modest space downtown with peeling paint and flickering lights, but to her it was everything. She stood in the empty room that day, sunlight filtering through the blinds, and whispered a silent thank you to herself. She had turned pain into purpose. But success didn't erase the scars. One evening, as she was scrolling through industry news, she came across an article that froze her in place. Her old company, Linvale Communications, was struggling. Their reputation had taken a hit. Clients were leaving. There were rumors of mass layoffs. And the photo accompanying the article showed Charles Bennett, the same man who had once told her she didn't fit their image, looking weary and desperate. Amara stared at the screen for a long time, emotions swirling. She didn't feel joy or revenge, not yet, just quiet vindication. The next morning, she received a message on LinkedIn. It was from one of her former coworkers, someone who had laughed behind her back. The message congratulated her on her company's success and asked if she might be hiring. Amara read the message twice, then closed her laptop. The irony wasn't lost on her. As True Tone Media continued to rise, her name began to spread in industry circles. Articles called her a disruptor, a visionary, the face of the new marketing era. She was invited to speak at conferences about diversity in advertising, where she told her story, not with bitterness, but with truth. But fate, she knew, had a strange sense of timing. A few months later, while she was reviewing proposals at her office, her assistant entered the room with an envelope. It bore a familiar logo, Linvale Communications. Inside was a letter. They wanted to discuss a potential acquisition. Her breath caught. The same company that had once fired her for her natural hair now wanted to buy her company. She leaned back in her chair, the memory of that humiliating day flickering in her mind like a shadow. The irony was delicious. But this wasn't the end. This was the beginning of something far greater. She folded the letter carefully and set it aside. The next chapter of her story wasn't just about revenge. It was about power earned, not given. Amara sat in her office long after everyone else had gone home. The letter from Linvale Communications lay open on her desk, its words burned into her memory. They were struggling, losing clients, relevance, and credibility. The same company that had once seen her as unfit was now reaching out for help. The irony was almost poetic. She could still remember the day she had walked out of their glass doors, a box of her belongings in hand, her dignity hanging by a thread. The image had haunted her for months. Her coworkers' pitying glances, the HR manager's cold smile, the sting of being reduced to a stereotype. And now, years later, fate had circled back. But Amara wasn't the same woman they had fired. She was sharper, stronger, more calculating. Her pain had become her armor. Still, she didn't answer the letter immediately. She took her time, 3 weeks to be exact, before agreeing to a meeting. Not out of pettiness, but out of strategy. She wanted them to understand that she was no longer desperate for their validation. They were the ones coming to her now. When the day of the meeting arrived, she dressed with quiet confidence. Her curls were bold, defined, and free. She wore a sleek black suit, gold earrings that caught the light, and the same beige notebook she had carried on her first day at Linvale. It was symbolic, a reminder of where she'd started and how far she'd come. As she stepped into the building, memories rushed back. The same marble floors, the same scent of stale coffee, the same hum of conversation. Only this time, people noticed her for a different reason. Employees whispered her name as she passed. They knew who she was. The CEO of True Tone Media, the woman whose campaigns were reshaping the industry. She was escorted into the conference room where the executives waited. At the head of the table sat Charles Bennett, older now, his confidence dulled. The arrogance that once defined him had been replaced by exhaustion. His company was crumbling, and he knew it. They made their pitch, explaining how Linvale needed a strategic partnership to modernize their image. Their language was careful, almost rehearsed. They spoke of diversity initiatives and fresh perspectives, phrases that sounded hollow coming from the same people who had once rejected her for simply being herself. Amara listened quietly, her expression unreadable. Inside, her emotions warred between satisfaction and sadness. It wasn't revenge she wanted. It was justice, recognition, and change. When they finished, she thanked them for the proposal and said she would review it. Her tone was polite but distant. She could feel their discomfort in the silence that followed, as though they knew how ridiculous it all sounded. That night, as she sat in her office overlooking the city, she replayed the meeting in her mind. She thought of the employees still trapped in that toxic environment, still shrinking themselves to fit in. She thought of her younger self, sitting in that same building, believing she wasn't enough. She didn't just want to save her company, she wanted to transform theirs. Within a month, negotiations began. Linvale offered to acquire True Tone Media for a substantial sum, positioning it as a subsidiary under their umbrella. Amara countered with a bolder offer, one that stunned their board. She would only agree if she could assume full creative control over Linvale's rebranding and future marketing direction. Essentially, she wasn't selling her company. She was taking theirs. The executives hesitated, but desperation left them little choice. Their stock was falling, their reputation in ruins, and Amara's name carried credibility they could no longer buy elsewhere. Eventually, they accepted. When the papers were signed, she sat across from Charles Bennett one last time. He extended his hand, his smile forced but polite. Amara shook it, her grip firm, her gaze steady. The same man who had fired her for her natural hair had just handed her the keys to his failing empire. The irony wasn't lost on her, or anyone else. Within weeks, Amara began restructuring Linvale from the inside out. She replaced outdated leadership, diversified her teams, and introduced policies that prioritized inclusion and transparency. Gone were the days of silencing authenticity for the sake of image. The changes weren't easy. Some resisted her leadership, others left entirely. But Amara didn't flinch. She led with conviction, grace, and a quiet fierceness that commanded respect. True Tone Media flourished under her leadership, and soon, Linvale began to rise again, this time with a new reputation. Clients returned, drawn by the authenticity of the brand's new vision. Employees felt inspired for the first time in years, and yet, for Amara, the most satisfying part wasn't the numbers or headlines. It was the symbolism. Every ad campaign, every corporate shift, every success was proof that what had once been seen as unprofessional had become the very definition of progress. But fate wasn't done testing her yet. One evening, while reviewing quarterly reports, Amara received a call. It was from HR, Linvale's internal department. There was an issue with one of the employees. Discrimination complaints, they said. Someone claiming they had been mistreated for not fitting in. The word sent a chill through her. She requested the name of the employee in question. When the HR rep hesitated before speaking, Amara already knew the answer. It was Megan, the same woman who had once mocked her hair, her voice, her presence. The same woman who had laughed as Amara packed her box years ago. Now the cycle had come full circle. Amara set the phone down, staring out her window at the city lights below. The past was knocking again, but this time she held the power to decide what came next. Would she show the same cruelty she once endured, or would she rise above it? The night after that phone call, Amara lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the hum of the city muffled beyond her window. The news about Megan echoed in her mind. The woman who had once made her feel small, who had turned her natural beauty into a target of ridicule, was now facing the same system she had once upheld. It would have been easy, satisfying even, to let karma do its work, to allow Megan to feel the sting of rejection, the burn of being deemed unfit. The universe, it seemed, had a way of balancing its scales. But Amara wasn't sure she believed in revenge anymore. She had built everything she had by rising above the ugliness, by refusing to let hate define her. Still, the temptation lingered, a whisper of her old pain, urging her to even the score. The next morning, she arrived at the office early. The air was quiet, the halls still dim with the soft gray of dawn. She stood by the window in her corner office, sipping her coffee, watching the sunlight creep over the skyline. From this height, the world seemed vast and indifferent, its drama small beneath the weight of time. Megan arrived for her meeting right on schedule, escorted by HR. She looked different, nervous, worn down, far from the smug woman Amara remembered. Years had chipped away at her confidence. The reports described her as difficult to work with, dismissive toward younger staff, and resistant to the company's diversity initiatives. In short, she had become the embodiment of the culture Amara had been fighting to change. As Amara read through the file, she felt a mix of sadness and irony. The same behaviors that once earned Megan approval had now made her obsolete. The world was changing, and she hadn't adapted. When HR asked how to proceed, Amara requested to handle the situation personally. The team seemed surprised but agreed. She met Megan in the conference room later that day. The atmosphere was tense, sterile, heavy with unspoken history. Megan fidgeted with her hands, her eyes darting between the floor and the window. Amara studied her quietly, searching for the woman who once laughed at her pain. But all she saw now was fear. The easy thing would have been to fire her, the poetic thing. But Amara knew that true power wasn't in repeating the cruelty she'd endured. It was in breaking the cycle entirely. So instead of punishment, she offered perspective. She told Megan that the company was evolving, that empathy and inclusivity were not just trends but the foundation of progress. She reminded her that leadership required humility, the ability to listen, to learn, to grow. Her words weren't warm, but they were firm, deliberate. They cut deeper than any insult ever could. Megan sat silent through it all, her face pale. When Amara finished, she simply nodded. For the first time, there was no defiance in her eyes, only regret. After Megan left, Amara stood alone in the conference room. The power dynamic between them had reversed completely. Yet, instead of triumph, she felt a quiet peace. She had proven to herself that she was no longer the same woman they had once broken. She had risen above them, not just in success, but in grace. In the weeks that followed, Linvale continued to transform. Under Amara's leadership, the company thrived. Diversity was no longer a buzzword. It was a lived reality. Campaigns that once relied on stereotypes now celebrated authenticity. The office buzzed with creative energy, the kind that came from people who finally felt seen. Industry magazines hailed Amara as a visionary. Her story spread online, the woman who redefined corporate culture. Young professionals reached out to her, thanking her for paving the way. But with visibility came scrutiny. Not everyone celebrated her rise. One morning, an anonymous op-ed appeared in a business blog accusing her of using her personal story for attention and playing the victim card. The article claimed she had only succeeded by capitalizing on identity politics. It went viral within hours. The words were cruel, dismissive, and painfully familiar. They reminded her of every meeting, every interview, every subtle rejection that had told her she didn't belong. Only now, the attacks were louder, public, amplified by strangers who knew nothing of her struggle. She tried to ignore it at first, but the backlash grew. Her inbox flooded with hate mail. Sponsors hesitated. A board member suggested she issue a soft apology to maintain the company's image. Amara refused. She wasn't going to apologize for existing, for succeeding, for standing in her truth. Instead, she called an emergency company meeting. Her employees gathered in the conference hall, curious and concerned. She stood before them, not as their CEO, but as a woman reclaiming her narrative. She spoke from the heart, without a script. She talked about the double standards, the coded language, the quiet battles fought in hallways and boardrooms. She told them how she had been told her hair was unprofessional, how she had been made to feel small, and how she had turned that pain into purpose. She reminded them that change was never comfortable, and that progress always faced resistance. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Then one by one, her employees began to clap. It spread, building into thunderous applause. That moment went viral too, but for very different reasons. Articles that once questioned her legitimacy now celebrated her authenticity. Her words were quoted across platforms, inspiring countless others who had faced similar struggles. And then came a letter, this time not from Linvale or HR or an anonymous critic. It was from a young woman who had been fired from her own job for wearing her natural hair. She wrote that Amara's story gave her the courage to sue her employer and win. Reading those words, Amara realized her mission had grown beyond her own redemption. She had become a symbol of resilience for others who had been silenced. But the world wasn't done testing her yet. A few months later, during a board meeting, an unexpected announcement shattered the calm. Linvale's largest investor, the same one who had backed Amara's takeover, was retiring. His replacement was someone from her past. The name on the file made her chest tighten. Charles Bennett. The man who had once fired her was returning, not as her superior this time, but as her business partner. The past, it seemed, was not finished with her yet. The day Charles Bennett re-entered her life felt like a cruel twist of fate. His name on that investor report hit her like a ghost resurrected. One she had long buried under success, pride, and forgiveness. For a moment, she sat frozen in the boardroom, her colleagues chatting idly around her, oblivious to the storm raging inside her chest. Her mind drifted back to that day years ago. The coldness in his tone, the smug smile when he told her that her natural hair wasn't professional. The way he had stripped her of dignity with nothing but corporate politeness. Now, that same man was about to walk into her building, not as her boss, not as the gatekeeper who once barred her path, but as a partner seeking alignment with her company's future. When he arrived for their first meeting, time seemed to slow. His hair had thinned, his face aged by stress and years of damage control. Yet his eyes carried that same calculating sharpness. He extended his hand, polite and composed, as if their history were nothing more than a forgotten footnote. Amara greeted him with measured calm. Outwardly, she was every inch the CEO, collected, powerful, unreadable. But inside, her heart pounded with a quiet rage that she struggled to contain. The meeting began in a haze of corporate pleasantries. Charles spoke about strategic opportunities, mutual benefits, and shared visions. His tone was smooth, rehearsed, the language of businessmen who had spent decades avoiding accountability. But beneath his words, she sensed something else: desperation. Linvale's old investors had faltered. Charles needed this partnership far more than she did. For years, he had thrived in a world where power belonged to people like him. Men who could discriminate without consequence. Men who shaped careers and destroyed them without a second thought. Now, the balance had shifted, and she was the one holding the power. In the following weeks, their professional relationship unfolded like a slow, silent battle. Charles tried to assert subtle control, offering unsolicited advice, questioning decisions in meetings, and praising her progressive image, with the faint condescension of someone still trapped in an older world. But Amara had learned too much to be shaken. Every time he spoke, she countered with precision, intellect, and undeniable results. She didn't raise her voice or break composure. She simply let her success speak louder than his ego ever could. Still, working alongside him reopened old wounds. Some nights, she found herself unable to sleep, replaying every slight, every look of dismissal. She wondered whether forgiveness meant forgetting, or simply refusing to let the past poison the present. Then one afternoon, during a high-profile investor event, karma revealed its hand once more. Charles had been scheduled to lead a presentation about Linvale's transformation under Amara's leadership. But as he began to speak, his old arrogance resurfaced. He downplayed her achievements, implying that her image-focused initiatives were secondary to his strategic direction. The audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension. Amara sat still at first, her jaw tight, her expression unreadable. But when he made a thinly veiled remark about how corporate diversity shouldn't overshadow business fundamentals, something inside her snapped. Without a word, she stood and walked to the stage. The audience watched in silence as she took the microphone, her voice calm but resonant, each word measured and deliberate. She didn't confront him directly. She didn't need to. Instead, she spoke about the foundation of Linvale's renewal, the power of inclusion, authenticity, and truth. She reminded the room that diversity wasn't a distraction but the engine of innovation. She shared statistics, results, and stories that made her point undeniable. By the time she finished, the applause was thunderous. Charles sat behind her, his face flushed, his authority dismantled, not by anger but by truth. That night, he avoided her eyes as they crossed paths in the hallway. The humiliation was evident in his silence. Amara didn't gloat. She simply nodded and walked past him, the click of her heels echoing like punctuation marks on a sentence long overdue. But fate wasn't finished delivering its lessons. Weeks later, Charles missed several meetings. Rumors swirled of health issues, but no one knew the details. One morning, HR informed Amara that he had collapsed at home and was in critical condition. A strange stillness filled her chest when she heard the news. It wasn't joy nor sorrow, just a quiet recognition of how time comes for everyone. A few days later, she received a message from the hospital. Charles had requested to see her. For hours, she debated whether to go. Part of her wanted to refuse, to leave him to the consequences of his own arrogance. But another part, the part that had always believed in grace, even when it wasn't deserved, knew she needed closure. So she went. The hospital room was sterile and cold, machines humming softly in the background. Charles looked frail, his skin pale and eyes sunken. When he saw her, a faint flicker of recognition passed across his face. He didn't speak at first, his voice weak, words barely forming. But when he did, there was no arrogance left, only remorse. He spoke of mistakes, of blind ambition, of the ways he had justified cruelty in the name of professionalism. Amara listened quietly, her heart conflicted. He told her he had seen her speech, her company's transformation, her strength. And for the first time, he said something she had never expected to hear: an apology. It wasn't perfect, nor eloquent, but it was real. And in that fragile sincerity, she saw the final unraveling of the man who once believed himself untouchable. She left the hospital in silence, the city lights blurring through her tears. Not tears of pity, but of release. She had carried that pain for so long, and now it was no longer hers to bear. As she walked into the night, she realized that forgiveness didn't mean excusing the past. It meant reclaiming her peace from it. Still, one truth lingered in the air like a whisper: the story wasn't over yet. Because the next morning, she received a call that would change everything. Charles Bennett had passed away overnight, and with his death came one final surprise. He had left her something in his will. The news of Charles Bennett's death spread quickly through the company. For most, it was a somber footnote in the rhythm of corporate life. A man who had once ruled with quiet authority, now gone without fanfare. But for Amara, it was something deeper, more complicated. His name had been the beginning of her pain, the spark that ignited her journey, and now, even in death, he lingered, closing a circle she had never expected to reopen. The following week, a lawyer contacted her with instructions to attend a private reading of Charles's will. Curiosity wrestled with caution as she walked into the sterile conference room where the executor waited. The man offered her a small envelope and a thin smile. Inside was a letter, written in shaky handwriting. Charles had left her his personal shares in Linvale Communications, enough to make her the company's largest single shareholder. The letter was short, but its message was heavy. He wrote that he had spent years convincing himself he had done nothing wrong, That business was business. But after watching her rebuild everything he had destroyed, he understood the truth. His final act, he said, was not penance, but acknowledgement. He wanted her to own what he had once denied her, the power to lead without permission. As Amara folded the letter, her throat tightened. The irony was staggering. The man who had once told her she didn't fit the company's image had, in the end, handed her the keys to it. But she didn't feel triumphant. She felt something quieter, acceptance. A few days later, she stood before her employees at an all-hands meeting. The air in the auditorium buzzed with curiosity. She announced that she had inherited Charles's shares and would be assuming full control of the company's strategic direction. The room erupted in applause, but she raised her hand to calm them. She told them that this moment wasn't about victory over one man. It was about transformation, about how systems could change when courage outlasted cruelty. Under her leadership, Linvale evolved beyond recognition. Offices opened in underserved communities. Internship programs brought in students who had been overlooked by traditional hiring paths. Campaigns featured real people, real stories, real faces, hair, skin, and voices once deemed unfit, now celebrated on billboards across the nation. True Tone Media, her first company, merged seamlessly into Linvale's structure, forming a powerhouse of authentic storytelling. Together, they redefined what professionalism looked like. For years, the industry had treated diversity as a checkbox. Under Amara, it became the foundation of innovation. She was invited to speak at global conferences, honored with awards, and named one of the most influential CEOs in the country. But the moments that meant the most weren't the accolades. They were the quiet ones. Like when a young black woman approached her after a speech, tears in her eyes, and said that seeing Amara in power made her believe she could wear her natural hair to an interview. Or when she visited a new office and saw portraits of employees from every background lining the walls. Proof that change was possible, tangible, and alive. Yet even in success, she never forgot the beginning. Sometimes, late at night, she'd revisit her old memories. The cramped apartment where True Tone was born, the humiliating day she was escorted out of Linvale, the bitter cold that had followed. Those moments were part of her, but they no longer defined her. One evening, as she walked through Linvale's headquarters, she passed the wall of executives' portraits. Charles's photo was still there, his younger self staring out with quiet confidence. For a long moment, she stood in front of it, studying his face. Then she turned to her assistant and gave a simple instruction: move the portraits to a new wall, one that included everyone who had contributed to Linvale's rebirth, not just those who once ruled it. It wasn't an act of erasure. It was evolution. A few months later, she received a letter from Charles's daughter, a woman Amara had never met. She wrote to thank Amara for her grace, saying her father had spoken often about his regrets before he died. He had called Amara the kind of leader I never had the courage to be. That letter stayed in Amara's desk drawer, unopened but never forgotten. Years passed, and Linvale became a case study in business schools, a story of redemption through reform. When journalists wrote about Amara's rise, they often framed it as poetic justice. But to her, it wasn't about revenge. It was about breaking a pattern so that others would never have to live what she had endured. One morning, during a leadership retreat, she shared her story with new recruits, young professionals just beginning their careers. She told them about resilience, about self-worth, about how the very things the world tells you to hide often become your greatest power. As she spoke, sunlight poured through the windows, catching the soft glow of her natural curls. The room was silent, captivated. And in that silence, she realized something profound. What began as an act of survival had become a movement of liberation. Not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. Her journey had started with pain and ended with purpose. And though the scars of the past would always remain, they had become something beautiful. Proof that even the deepest wounds could grow into strength. As she looked out at the faces before her, diverse, hopeful, fearless, Amara knew this was only the beginning. The story that began with rejection had ended with rebirth. And this time no one would ever tell her, or anyone like her, to change who they were to fit someone else's definition of success. Because she hadn't just rewritten her own story. She had rewritten the rules. The end.